Hello, my name is Lakin and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I am going to be discussing all the books that I read in February. So if you're interested in seeing what I read and what I thought, stick around. I read a good chunk of books, and I feel like that has to do with my February book bingo, which was the first time I did my book bingo. Very proud of it. I'll even put a completed version of the bingo board on the screen to kind of so you can see what all the things were. If you're interested in hearing more about the bingo board itself, you can watch my most recent video, which is my March TBR video, where I create the bingo board for March, as well as discuss the bingo board for February. So, let's go ahead and get started with the books we read. Starting with the very first book that I read this month, which was Fangs by Sarah Anderson. This is a graphic novel about a vampire who falls in love and starts dating a werewolf. And I gave this book 5 stars. This is the absolute cutest vampire werewolf love story, and it's told like it's not a continuous story throughout the whole graphic novel. It's more of pages are comics, and they're all telling the same story, but they're telling it through seeing different snippets of their lives together, which I want more of. I want more supernatural creatures just living their normal lives. And it was great. It was great. The next book I read was The Stonewall Reader by the New York Library. This is a nonfiction book that discusses the Stonewall riots, or at least that's what I was expecting when I first went in. But this book does discuss the Stonewall riots, but it also discusses the LGBTQ+ activism, just different aspects of that time period and stuff like that. So this book was very informative, and I really enjoyed listening to it, especially because there were times when, as I was listening to it as an audiobook, they had the actual audio from the original, either interviews or stuff like that, where you could hear their voices, and I loved that because there was so much other besides just the Stonewall riots itself. It was very confusing on where this book was trying to go and what it was trying to discuss. For what these people did and what these people went through, it's hard not to admire them for all that they've done for us, because we don't have to go through what they went through. And so for that, I feel like everyone needs to read this, just because their stories deserve to be known by everyone. So even though this wasn't the book that I was expecting it to be when I picked it up, I still really enjoyed it. I gave it, I don't know if I said the star rating, but I gave it 3 stars. That's just because there was so much information coming in from all these different sources that it was hard to figure out what it was trying to say and what it was trying to accomplish, other than just throwing information in my face. The next book I read was The Summer Children, which is the 3rd book in the Collector series, and I gave this book 2 stars. Oh my goodness. Okay. The Collector series is a thriller series, which I didn't know it was a series until after I read the first one. The first one, 5 stars. One of my favorite thrillers of all time. Everyone needs to read The Butterfly Garden. Everyone. And then when I saw it was a series, I was like, okay, are we going to be continuing to follow the butterflies? Are we going to be continuing, like, how is this a series? What are we doing? In this series, we follow the detectives, which in the first one, the detective wasn't really a big part of the story. We were mainly following the victims and stuff like that. And then in the second one, we were also, like, the detective was more involved, but we were still following a victim, and it was of a different serial killer. But then in this one, this third one, this is truly a detective crime thriller, which is not my favorite at all. Especially because, like, the detective in this book is very stereotypical detective main character. Nothing new about them at all. I guess the only, like, new interesting thing is that they're a female and they're a lesbian, but literally everything else, they have the same mannerisms, the same stone cold outside but soft inside, and like just all the typical stuff that you would expect from a detective in a thriller novel. That's what our main character had. And because this was so drastically different from the first two, it was really disappointing. And if I had known what this was, I probably wouldn't have read it, because this just wasn't for me. The concept of this book, like our serial killer that we're trying to find, is an angel who is killing parents and taking the children and dropping them on the detective's doorstep. And we find out that the parents are abusive. And so it's kind of like a vigilante sort of scenario. But it just gets worse and worse and worse. And so, like, the antagonist, the villain of the story, the serial killer, whatever you want to call them, their motives and how it unfold and, like, all that stuff, 5 out of 5 stars. I loved that part of this, and that's really the only saving grace of this novel, is the serial killer. Which is A Luminous Republic by Andreas Barbera. I think I'm saying the last name correctly. But this is a translated novel, originally written in Spanish, and I gave it 4 stars. This is sort of like Lord of the Flies, but if the kids were not on an island, they were just in the forest or the jungle, and they started coming into town. And so it's from the perspective of this man who is looking back on this summer when 30 feral kids came into his town and wreaked havoc. If you hear me saying this is like Lord of the Flies and you immediately turn off, like, I think you would still enjoy it, because it's not strictly Lord of the Flies. It has what I imagine would be the parents' perspective of this group of 30 Lord of the Fly-ish kids. And it's just interesting to watch how these adults villainize these children because they don't follow societal standards. The ending is so heartbreaking, but this book was really good. The only issues with this book is pacing. This book at times felt like it was meant to be like a fast-paced book. It's so slow to read it. Normally, when I listen to audiobooks, books fly by. This one, I was listening to it on audiobook, and I would, like, keep checking it, and it would feel like I've listened to it for hours, but then it was only like 30 minutes. And it's just like, It was good, but it was just very off, if that makes sense. Like, me used to reading faster paced novels, or if it just truly was, like, at times meant to be exciting and fast paced, but, like, it just couldn't come across. I don't know if that makes sense. The next book I read is The Body Is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor. I gave this book 3 stars. This is a nonfiction book that, even though I'm giving it 3 stars, like, I think literally everyone should read this. This is recommended reading. You have to read this book. And one of the things that comes with this book is a workbook that you can kind of work on, which I love that. Because this is sort of self-helpy, but it's not really self-helpy, if that makes sense. But the self-help parts, I think every self-help book should come with a workbook so you can actually work on yourself. This book is about radical self-love and how the way we view other people's bodies and our own bodies affects literally every part of our lives. And so because of that, it's not really self-help. Like, yes, the author wants you to love yourself, and the author wants you to accept your body and to come to just truly love yourself. But through radical self-love, it also goes into loving everyone else and having a level of empathy that can translate to every walk of life. As someone who has gone through and struggled with my own body neutrality, self-love, like, journey, this is a book that if I had read it earlier, I would have, like, needed to hear these words. But where I am now, a lot of the statements were very much things that I already believe. And so because of that, the only things that I could, like, really sit and chew on and think about were the parts about, like, how that translates to other people. But yeah, I do think, like, this is a book that even if you're like me and you feel like, oh yeah, I love my body, I accept my body, like, even if you feel like that, I think you should still read this because there are things that you can learn from this book. The next book I read was my first 1 star of the year. And that is a graphic novel known as Taproot by Keezy Young. Where do I even start? I guess I can start with the thing I did like, and that's the art. The art is very beautiful, and I really appreciated the art. But that's it. This was marketed to me as a wholesome LGBTQ queer love story, and I am here for that. I was ready for that. I was ready for a ghost to fall in love with a gardener. That's what I was expecting. That's what I was ready for. No, not at all. I don't even know how to explain this book because it is so all over the place. The thing that you expect the whole book to be is, like, the first 2 pages. And then the next, like, 3 pages is another story. And then the next 3 is, like, another one. And it just keeps going. But it's not like they're actual segments. It's not like, okay, this is a story and this is a story. It's not like Fangs, how Fangs was like a slice of life thing. Like, it's meant to be read as one continuous story. Like, because they have, like, things where it's, like, transitioning from one to the other. But it's just, like, so many different stories that it just doesn't make sense. Like, the logic in this world, I couldn't grasp. And maybe that's me. Maybe this book is way too highbrow for me and it just went over my head. So, like, if you really want a wholesome queer love story graphic novel with, like, pretty art, I would just suggest a different book. There's plenty of them. The next book I read was The Jumbies by Tracey Baptiste. This is the first book in a middle grade series, and I gave this book 2 stars. And this is the first middle grade book that I've read where I'm like, wow, this is really, like, I am way out of the target audience for this. most of the time when I read middle grades, like, I know I'm not the target audience. Like, I know the target audience is 10-year-olds, but I still enjoy them, and I have no complaints about them majority of the time. But this one, I was like, wow, I am old. So, like, I feel like if you're the target audience, like, this would be a 4-star book. Like, if I was 10 years old, this would be a 4-star book. This book was a little too fast-paced, and, like, it just starts and it goes, and in a way that, like, doesn't feel natural. It feels like someone wrote it to be that fast instead of it just, like, escalating naturally. I mean, it's something you could get, like, lost in, and you can just enjoy the ride if you're, like, you just accept that this is gonna be a roller coaster that just goes up and up really fast. Like, you can, like, you could have a fun time with this book. Like, I enjoyed reading it as I was reading it, but after I was done, I literally forgot about this book 2 seconds after I finished reading it, which does not happen. Usually, like, I need to, like, usually after I read a book, I sit with it and I think about it, and I think about what happened and all this stuff, and I think about the characters, and especially if it's a series like this, I think about what's gonna come next and all these things. But this one, I literally dead silence in my brain, which to me told me that I needed to give it 2 stars, because obviously I'm not gonna remember this book at all. I think I'm still gonna continue the series, mainly because the second one deals with mermaids, and I'm a sucker for a mermaid book. And also, like, I enjoyed the concept enough to continue the series, and I just hope that I can, as I continue to read this series, like, I enjoy it more. The next book I read was The Perfect Ruin by Sharona Williams. I gave this book 5 stars. Oh my goodness, this thriller was so good. So, in this thriller, we're following this girl who something happened in her past, and she finds out the person who did it. She finds out the person who destroyed her life. And so she's decided to make this plan to infiltrate that person's life and destroy their life from the inside out. That right there is amazing enough. So we know there's gonna be a twist, but the twist was even more twisty than I thought it was going to be. Like, I kind of expected this to be your typical revenge thriller and not much more to it. And it was a good enough time just knowing that. When the twist actually happens, you're like, wait, what? Like, it took me a good few beats to realize, like, and comprehend what was going on. Like, I could not have thought that this was the way it was gonna go. I had never heard of this book, but I picked it up because it was the thriller group pick for Blackathon. I tried to pick up all the other group books, but either I'd read them already or they just weren't available to me. But this was the only one that was, and I'm so glad I did. Like, I still think about this book. So the next book I read was Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler, and I gave this book 4 stars. So this book was obviously written way back when, but it's set in 2026, so not too far from us. And the fact that it is, I mean, it's a little far off in, like, certain aspects. Like, we wouldn't be able to be there in 2026, but the fact that we may be there in, like, 2040 or 2035, so terrifying. And, like, so eerily spot on in things where it's like, oh, we're still headed in that direction. Like, Octavia E. Butler is not wrong. It was so good. Half the time, though, like, I had to dock off a star because half the time I didn't know where we were going with this book. It just felt like it was kind of going on and on and on. As well as, at times, it no longer felt like a fiction book. It felt like a non-fiction book of someone explaining their religious and moral beliefs to me. And there's just like so much of a disconnect at time where it was just like chunks of explaining things and like explaining how our main character views the world, and then it would go back into this like brutal, horrific, dystopian world full of murder and all this other stuff. I'm very sensitive to gore and blood and stuff like that. Like, I just even thinking about it now, like, no. But this book, I never felt like that, even though like it would talk about, like at one point it talks about someone who has had their skin taken off and body parts just laying there, and then like there's these people who take this drug and they burn fires because it feels better than having sex, and sometimes they like throw people into the fires and watch them burn and stuff like that. And so like there's very horrific things that happen in this book. It's a very dystopian world that if I had to live in this world, no, I'm sorry, not gonna do it. It would say just enough that you got it, but it wouldn't keep letting you know. And I think that's one of the things I really like about this book, is it went really in depth. Like the world felt really whole and full, and like you were stepping into this world and there wasn't any white spots or like blank areas. But it didn't like drone on and on and on. The only thing it droned on and on and on about was her religious Earthseed stuff. The next book I read was Yotsuba, Volume 7 by Kiyohiko Azuma. This is a manga. It's probably my favorite manga of all time. This is a slice of life manga where we follow a single dad and his like 4 or 5-year-old daughter, and like as she discovers the world. And it is so funny, so cute. I gave this one 3 stars because it was cute and there were a lot of the stories that I really enjoyed, but it wasn't my favorite one, because usually in these mangas I'm like laughing out loud and like taking pictures to show my partner different parts, but like this one wasn't too like that. The next book I read was Comfort Me with Apples by Catherynne Valente. I gave this book 4 stars, and literally, what the fuck? WTF. I went into this book knowing nothing. The only thing I was told is it's kind of feels like has like Stepford Wives vibes, which I love that movie. So I was all for it. And this book is short. Like it was like a 2-hour, 3-hour audiobook. And literally after I finished listening to it, I forced my partner to read it. And then they read it and they immediately reread it again. And I also was very tempted to reread it again, especially because it was so short. Everything within, like, you think the book is like, ooh, what is this? This is intriguing. Okay, we're going this way. And then all of a sudden you veer left and you're falling down a cliff. It's insane, but an amazing insane. The only reason I docked it down is because I would have loved it to have, like, obviously still taken that turn, but like longer. I need it to be longer. I need to follow down that hole a little bit more instead of just being like thrown to the bottom of it. Everything's wrapped up in like 2 seconds and then the book ends. And you're just laying there at the bottom of this pit trying to figure out what in the world just happened and how you got there. The next book I read was A Dance of Silver and Shadow by Melanie Cellier. This is the first book in the Beyond the Four Kingdoms series. So last month I finished the Four Kingdoms series, which is a fairy tale retelling series, and this one continues it in just a different part of the world. And this one was a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses. I've never read or heard that fairy tale, so like I can't say if this was a good retelling or not, but I gave this book 4 stars overall. Like I enjoyed the book. Like I enjoyed what was done with it. And again, I don't know. I, like, in the other books where I know what the story is, like, I could see the hints of the story and, like, how she used the story and, like, twisted it to make it her own and stuff like that. But because of this one, I don't know that. So I don't know how accurate or inaccurate it is. But overall, this story, we follow, it's like a few years or a lot of years later from the Four Kingdoms. And, like, the little sisters of all the people who got married, the 3 of them are coming to this new world that they've just discovered to try to, you know, find princes because everyone's already married in their kingdoms. So we're following those 3 and that's how it carries over. But really, you could, like, start this series without reading that one. Actually, you could, like, read all of these books as standalones because they're just romance stories. But yeah, this was a good one. And in this one, it really set up pretty much all the other romances that are gonna come in this series. There's a tournament in this book where whoever wins has to be betrothed to this beast of a prince. So obviously that's setting up a Beauty and the Beast retelling. Because our main character is our main character, we know she isn't going to win, even though she's trying to win to protect everyone else. Like, even though we know she isn't going to win, it's still, like, I'm still invested in the story. And, like, by the end of it, I'm like, what's going to happen? Which I think leads to a good, like, romance, because romance books, they always have the exact same ending. You know what's going to happen by the end of it. But if you can still carry me on this journey to where, like, I kind of believe that, like, oh, these stakes are real, even though, like, in the back of my head, I know they're ending up together. Like, that's just a good romance, and that's what the story did. The next book I read was How to Argue with a Racist, What Our Genes Do and Don't Say About Human Difference by Adam Rutherford. I gave this book 4 stars. So with the first part of the title, How to Argue with a Racist, you kind of go into this book where it's like, okay, it's talking about genes, but it's also, like, kind of, like, you would expect it to, like, give, like, more talking points and, like, give, like, an argument racist people say, and then, like, debunking that argument with science and facts. But really, this book is just about the genetics and what we do and don't know about genetics, and pretty much basically we're all the same, and yet we know enough about genes, but we also know nothing about genes. And the people who claim racist things, touting science and stuff, usually they're touting it on science that is not falsified, but it's also not really understood or proven and stuff like that. As someone who, like, went to college as a science major and, like, loves genetics and genes and, like, playing with the little Punnett square of, like, what things will look like and all this type of stuff. Like, as someone who really loves this stuff, this was so interesting. But it's written in a way that is very comprehensive. So if you don't know anything about genes, you don't have a scientific background, like, I still think this is a very easy book to understand, as it lays out all the facts, and it isn't shy to say we don't know, instead of just being like, oh, this is this because of this. Instead, it's like, this is this, and it correlates with this, but we don't know if those actually two things, like, coincide. Like, it talks about, like, there's this gene that a lot of athletes have. And so, like, a lot of people assume that, oh, if you have this gene, you're gonna be a good athlete. But, like, we don't actually have any scientific proof that those two things correlate, as well as having a pure bloodline and all this stuff. Like, it goes back to where, like, if you go back far enough, we're literally all related. And there's no such thing as a pure bloodline in any sort of the term. I could talk about this book so much because it's so interesting. So, like, I really recommend this book. Like, even if you're not someone who, like, enjoys this kind of stuff, like, I think you could get stuff out of it. The next book I read was really disappointing, and that is The Lost World by Michael Crichton. This is the second Jurassic Park book, and I loved the first Jurassic Park book. I love the Jurassic Park movie trilogy. And also, Michael Crichton is one of my favorite authors. But this book, I gave it 2 stars. I was so bored. And I don't understand how a book about dinosaurs attacking people can be so boring. But the whole time I was reading this book, I just wanted to be watching the movie, which was not the case in the first one. The first one, I was so invested and, like, yeah, I wanted to watch the movie to just kind of see the differences. But, like, I was still super invested in the book the whole time. But this one, I was just like, ugh, I want this book to be over with. Like, I just want to watch the movie. A lot of stuff happens in this book, but it also felt like nothing was happening in this book. The next book I read was Darius the Great is Not Okay by Adib Khorram, and I gave this book 3 stars. This book deals with mental health and depression and just feeling isolated and alone and not understanding. This book was beautifully written. And if I had read this when I was younger, if I had read this when I was a teenager and I was feeling all these things and didn't have the language to understand what I was feeling, I would have been obsessed with this book. If younger me would be screaming from the rooftops about how amazing this book is. And even though I still struggle with these things, my need for a book like this is no longer as strong because I've come to understand myself and accept myself, and like, I've done the work that this book would have started. Darius himself is an amazing character, and he feels like a real live person, and the same with just the descriptions in general. As Darius goes to Iran for the first time, it feels like we're going to Iran for the first time, and it's beautiful and it's very descriptive. It again feels like the world is very fleshed out and there's no blank spots in it. Like, you can, like, fully step into this world, and I enjoyed that. The things that frustrated me, however, that I did not really love was how heavily the miscommunication trope was used. Especially with his relationship with his father. It was like they weren't allowed to actually communicate and understand each other. Even in times where it would have been, like, made sense for the dad to be like, hey, what's going on? Instead, he would just, like, walk away. Maybe that's accurate, but it's also just so sad, especially because, like, I just wanted to give Darius a hug the whole time, and because people, like, weren't really in his corner, it was just, like, frustrating. The next book I read was Luck of the Titanic by Stacey Lee. I was also disappointed by this book. I gave it 2 stars. Now, first off, let me say there needs to be more books like this. Like, there needs to be more books talking about the different types of people, the different walks of life that were on the Titanic, and not just the stories of the rich. There were, like, this book is a historical fiction about the Chinese men that were on the Titanic. And at the very beginning, it talks about that and how there were, I can't remember how many there were, but it basically tells you how many survived and how many died. At the very beginning, we follow a set of twins, a girl and a boy. I really enjoyed the relationships of this story, like, within their group. I also really enjoyed the Titanic elements of this story, but I feel like this author was trying to do way too much and put way too many different stories in this one book. We're on the Titanic, so we already have that big story, but then we also have the sister trying to reconnect with her brother and convince her brother that they need to be together. And then we also have their acrobats and they're wanting to join the circus. And then we also have that she snuck onto the boat and is parading around like a dead rich lady. So it's like a lot. It's a lot for this book. And like any one of those would have been interesting by itself, obviously with the Titanic also there. But like the cake was stacked really high, and because of that, none of the stories were really super delved into. They were all just surface level. And because of that, I was disappointed because I was left wanting more by the end of it. Now, the ending scene, we obviously know how it ends. Sort of. I mean, you know, the Titanic sinks. If you don't know that, surprise, the Titanic sunk. But we know where the book is going to end. But even so, even with it ending like that, it just felt so unsatisfying because we had all these things that we were juggling, and like by the end, like half of them just have to be abandoned because there's just not enough room on the plate. I really liked the ending, not the ending, but like after the book was done, I really liked how the author discussed the real men and how they, for a long time, weren't allowed to have their stories told and stuff like that. And so like I feel like I'm really glad this book exists, and I'm really glad I read it. I think I just put too many expectations on this book. The next book I read was Sever the Children by Craig DiLouie. I don't think I said that last name right, now that I'm saying it out loud. Even though, like, in my head, it makes perfect sense. But anyway, I gave this book 5 stars, and this was my favorite book I read this month. Oh my goodness. Yes. If you have to read one book from this list, read this one. This is a horror that, so good. Okay. So we follow like 3 families as not just this town, but the whole world experience the death of every single child. Anyone who has not gone through puberty, dead. All at the same time, like, bam, they're just gone. And no one knows why. And then they come back to life. All at the same time. Again, no one knows why. But, like, this book deals so heavily with, like, grief and the love of a parent and what depths you would go to keep your kid alive. Even though I'm childless, I don't expect to have children. No one really near me has children. The author did such a good job making me feel what these parents were feeling. I was so emotional throughout the whole book because I was just putting myself in these parents' shoes, and I was able to do so because of the author. And also I was just putting myself in the world if I was now. And even that itself, even without a child coming back, like, this world would be an absolute nightmare to live in. Like, this wasn't slasher scary. This wasn't even what's gonna happen scary. This was a psychological nightmare. This was one of those things where it's like, you can just stay up thinking about what if this was our world, and how absolutely terrifying just that thought is. And the end of this book may be a little unsatisfying for people. But it was the perfect way of ending this book. Like, they're so good. Favorite book of this month. Definitely a favorite of this year. Even though it's just month 2, it's gonna be a top 10. And after I read it, I needed to talk about it, but I know that my partner, this is not a book for them. They would absolutely hate this book because it is a horror and stuff like that. So, like, if you've read this book, please let me know so we can discuss it, because like I'm in desperate need of talking to someone about this book. And then the last book that I read. We're finally here at the last one. And this book is going to need a video all of its own. Some of these books are, but this one especially. It's called Unwrap My Heart by Alex Falcone. My partner found this book and sent it to me on TikTok. He sent it to me as a joke. But I decided this was the book we were going to read together. I gave this book 3 stars, and if this was a serious book, like if this book was trying to take itself seriously, it's a 1-star, 2-star book. But because it's a parody, I can let some things slide because I know it's a joke. But this is a parody of all the different paranormal romances that came around the Twilight time and the Twilight craze and era. But it's a girl named Sophia who falls in love with a mummy. There were so many parts in this book where I was laughing out loud, which I don't really do with books. The only thing was, this was a joke that went on so much longer than it needed to. The quirkiness of the main character was dialed up to a 10. Like, everything about this book was dialed up to a 10, and obviously that's part of the joke. But if you're continuing to read a book with such an insufferable main character, and it's meant to be insufferable, like, it's just like, okay, when is this joke ending? I'm ready to get off this ride. I don't know if I'm glad I read this or horrified that I read this. I don't know. But it's sticking with me. This book is never leaving my brain. If I am old and forget everything else, this will be the one thing I remember on my deathbed. So, yeah. That's how we're ending this wrap up. I'm sure this is really long. I read like 18 books. Let me know how many books, what books, your favorite book, your least favorite book. Let me know all the little details down in the comments about your February reading, and we can discuss them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you're having a great morning or evening whenever you're watching this, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!